was working as a truck driver for a logging company in northern Minnesota back in 2017. Most of the time I was hauling loads from pretty deep back in the woods, driving along empty stretches of dirt roads where you could go for hours without seeing another person. One evening in late October, I was finishing a haul just as the sun was going down. The air had that cold, damp bite to it, and I remember seeing a bit of mist rising from the ditches along the road. I had about 10 more miles before I would hit the highway when suddenly I saw something standing near the tree line up ahead. Just as anyone else that doesn't believe that things like this exist, my first thought was I was seeing a bear. It was big, dark, and it was slightly hunched over. And it was partially hidden by a tree. But as I got closer, I noticed something just didn't look right about this bear. It was way too tall, and its movements were not bear-like at all. It was shifting slightly, almost like it was debating whether to step out onto the road. It made me a nervous wreck, instantly. So I started to slow down, not wanting to hit something of that size. Not to mention, at this point, I had no idea what it even was. As the truck slowed, my headlights hit it fully, and that's when I finally got a good clear look. Needless to say, it wasn't a bear. It was standing on 2 legs, tall, maybe around 7 feet. It was covered in black fur, but the build of this creature was completely off. Its arms were longer than they should be. They were hanging down almost past its knees. It had broad shoulders like a man who had been going to the gym every day for the past 10 years. Its head was identical to that of a timber wolf. I could see clearly the tall, pointed ears and a very long muzzle. Its head was huge, easily 4 to 5 times bigger than any wolf that I had ever seen. I was amazed at how this thing just kept standing there on 2 legs. It wasn't shaky. It wasn't wobbly at all. This thing appeared to be very comfortable standing like a person, and it was watching me. And it was very aware of what was going on. It was extremely focused on my truck. I only saw this thing for a couple of seconds before it decided to take a step towards the road. It took one slow step. I didn't need to see anything else. I thought that I was definitely dealing with a werewolf. That is the only way that I would describe this thing. I punched it. My truck was screaming as I tore past this thing. I glanced in my side mirror only one time. It was still there, standing at the edge of the road, watching me go. I just kept driving until I hit the main highway. I found a little grocery store and I pulled over a few miles down the road. I just sit there in the parking lot for quite a while. I was pretty shaken up and confused at what I'd just seen. I never told my boss. I never told my coworkers. I had no idea how you're supposed to explain something like this to someone who wasn't there to see it. How do you tell someone that you drove past a werewolf that was standing in the woods watching you? They would have laughed at me and made fun of me until I would have had to quit my job. It would have been an endless, relentless ridicule. But whether I told anyone or not, I know what my eyes saw that day. I've driven down that road many times since, but never at night. I've never seen anything like that ever again, and if I'm being truthful, I hope and pray to God I never do. Thank you for your time. L. 'T. My uncle used to own a small hunting cabin out in the hills of eastern Kentucky. It was nothing nice or fancy, it just a single-room shack with no electric and an old wood-burning stove, and a couple of camping cots in each corner. He let me and my cousin Jason stay there sometimes when we wanted to get away for a weekend. We both enjoyed everything to do with nature and the outdoors, so it was the perfect place for us to go and chill for a couple of days. It was the fall of 2004. I was 19 and Jason was 21. We spent a whole weekend there just hunting and fishing like we always did. We had done this at least a dozen or more times before with no issues at all. But the second night, which would have been Saturday night, around 10:30 or 11 p.m., we were sitting outside in the front by the fire when we both started hearing something moving in the woods. We didn't pay it much mind, as we were used to the wildlife and just assumed it was a deer or maybe a coyote. Hell, it could have been anything. But we didn't think it was something like what we actually encountered. It wasn't until we realized whatever it was actually circling us. Jason grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the trees. We saw the thing almost instantly. It wasn't shy at all, wasn't even trying to hide. And if I was as big as it, I probably wouldn't be either. It was standing maybe 30 feet away, just at the edge of the light from our fire. It was tall, dark, and still. We couldn't see it fully, just the shape. We knew it was something on two legs with broad shoulders and long arms. We could see the faint glow of the eyes catching the light. Neither of us moved. It began letting out a slow, deep growl. It didn't sound anything like a bear, not like a bobcat. This sounded, in my opinion, evil. Definitely a growl that I was very unfamiliar with. It sounded big, and it sounded angry. Jason grabbed his rifle, and I grabbed mine. We slowly started backing away towards the cabin, making sure we didn't turn our backs on it. Luckily, we did make it inside, and we locked the door. For the next few hours, we heard it pacing all over outside. Every now and again, it would run past the cabin, banging on the walls as it passed. It actually banged on the door a couple of times as well. What's really weird is around 3 a.m. the thing just left. It was like it lost interest or decided that it wasn't having fun anymore. And that's exactly how I felt then, and I still feel that way now. This thing was acting like it was just playing with us, like it wanted to scare us. It wasn't even trying to actually get inside. We ended up staying awake until the sun rose, still holding our rifles. When we finally got the nerve to step outside, we found all kinds of scratch marks and claw marks all over the porch railings. We made it out of there with no more issues. And we never asked to stay at that cabin again. And my uncle? Yeah, he sold that property the very next year. He never gave anyone a legitimate reason why. Being as he went out there and stayed one weekend after we did and never went back, I can probably guess why. I appreciate your time, bub. James. In the summer of 2018, I was hiking alone in the upper peninsula of Michigan. I was near an old logging road that cut through miles of forest. I had planned a 3-day trip, camping along the way. This was something I was familiar with and did very often. Just me, my pack, and the quietness out in the woods. The second night, I set up camp near a small clearing not far from a stream that I'd found for water. Everything was as normal as you could ask for. The air was cool. The woods were alive with the sounds of crickets and other animals. I ate, read a little out of my Bible, then I turned in for the night. I have no idea what time it was, but I know it was late. I woke up. I didn't know why at first, just that something had jarred me awake. The first thing I noticed was outside my tent was completely silent. There were no more crickets, no owls, not even a gust of wind, just dead, suffocating stillness. I just laid there and, slowing my breathing, tried to listen. It didn't take me very long until I started hearing noises. Very slow and very heavy, obvious footsteps. I instantly thought this had to be another person out there because it was very easy to tell that these were heavy and bipedal steps. These steps moved with intent, and they just kept circling the outside of my tent. All I had for protection at the time was my knife, so I grabbed it as soon as I got my hand wrapped around it. The footsteps stopped. I don't know if the thing heard me moving or if it was just coincidence. Right outside the door of my tent, I hear a deep exhale. I didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then I began to hear a low clicking sound like claws tapping against something solid. And then, one of the scariest moments of my life, I saw the zipper of my tent shift and move. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight, and turned it on as fast as I could. In a quick flash, I saw the shadow of what looked like a huge canine-shaped head pass by the left side of my tent. I busted out of the tent, knife in one hand, light in the other, sweeping the entire area. My fire had burned down pretty low, almost completely out, barely giving me any light at all. But it didn't matter. I had my flashlight. I could see there was nothing there. Nothing I could see. No more movements, no sounds, nothing. But there was this weird smell. It was thick, musky. It was like wet dog and something else mixed. Maybe if you left raw chicken out in the sun for a few days. I built my fire back up and got back inside my tent and left the door unzipped so I could see outside. I laid there and watched and listened until the fire got low, then I would feed it more wood. I done this for the remainder of the night. Nothing else happened. The weirdest part about the story is when I got home. I was putting up all my equipment and I realized my tent was wet for some reason. It hadn't rained at all that night, so it definitely wasn't rainwater. I got it on my hands, too, as I was unfolding the tent to air it out and let it dry. It was definitely urine. Strong-smelling urine. Whatever was out there had urinated on the side of my tent. So now I know for sure something had been there. I wasn't just imagining things. I don't think that creature wanted me to know that it was there. I think it thought I was sleeping. I'm not sure exactly what it wanted, but I'm glad that I never found out. Everyone please stay safe when on adventures outdoors. Anonymous. West Virginia, 2009. My family owns the cabin in the mountains of West Virginia. They've owned it for years, as far as I can remember. It was passed down from my great-grandfather. It's been repaired multiple times over the decades, and it's very isolated. There's no cell service. There's also not a neighbor anywhere to be found for miles and miles. It's just on a winding dirt road leading up through some thick woods on both sides. Definitely not a place for anyone who doesn't enjoy being deep in the woods and isolated. I was 17 years old. It was the summer of 2009. I stayed there for about a week with my older brother Jake. We spent a lot of days fishing, some hiking, and just messing around. But at night, for some reason, the woods around us felt different. We would stay inside during the night. Anyway, the first night we were there, we heard noises outside in the woods. We heard a bunch of branches getting broke, snapping, something big moving inside the trees. At first, we figured it was possibly a bear. Nothing else in the area was big enough to break branches like that and make that much noise. But it never showed itself. It stayed hidden, watching us. The second night we were there, around midnight probably, Jake stepped out to grab some firewood off the porch. He was out there for maybe a minute before he came back in as white as a sheet. I remember him looking at me very seriously and saying, "There's something out there." I grabbed the flashlight and followed him back outside. We checked all around the cabin, and we saw nothing. But you could still feel it in the air. Something was heavy, something changed. It felt like the air was full of static, almost like before a big thunderstorm. It was very strange. Just as we were about to go back inside, I caught a slight glimmer of something. Something shining just inside the tree line. I got a little closer and held my light on them, and finally I realized it was a set of eyes. They were reflecting back at us from the dark. They were burning, a yellowish color. The funny thing is how tall and how high up off the ground these things were. I'm guessing 8 feet or higher. Just a guess, but I'm betting it's probably close. We just stood there watching for a couple seconds until the eyes blinked. That's when we knew for sure that we weren't just seeing things. Jake told me to get back inside now. We didn't run. We just moved slow. Got back inside, locked the door, and just sat there without speaking a word. I think we were both in shock at the time. We didn't hear anything for about an hour after that. Finally, we started hearing something slowly and steadily walking just outside the walls. We listened. It made its way around from the back of the cabin and ultimately onto the porch. We did have a hunting rifle, a lever-action .30-30. Jake was gripping onto it like he was getting ready to go to war. But to our relief, the footsteps finally walked off the porch and faded back off into the woods. By daylight, everything was normal, and that thing was gone. But when we stepped outside and started looking around, we did find some tracks. These were long, skinny tracks, almost like a human foot, but they had a canine pad with claws. I would say they were at least 16 inches long and not much shy of the size of a dinner plate. We left that very morning, haven't been back since. And listen to this. A month later, my uncle went up there to check on the place. He called my dad after. He told him someone had been up there. My dad asked him what he meant, how he knew someone was up there. My uncle said the front door was left wide open, but nothing had been taken. I know for a fact we didn't leave that door open. I remember asking Jake and double-checking that the door had been locked before we left. I think I know what opened that door. And the scariest part is I think it was looking for me and Jake. But unlucky for it, and lucky for us, we had already left. Thanks, Bobby. My encounter happened when I was only 10 years old. I went on a trip with my dad and 2 of his friends in the summer of 1991. It was the first time I'd ever gone on a real backcountry trip. No campgrounds, no outhouses, no other people around, just us and the wilderness, and a few tents pitched about a mile away from Barney Lake in California. Since no camping or campfires are allowed within a quarter mile of Barney Lake, we hiked to the upper end of the lake a quarter mile beyond to several adequate sites. The campsites can actually be found just off the trail along the granite ridge beyond the lake, but we decided to go on past those designated spots, in deeper into the woods. If you ever decide to do this, make sure to carry up your water because getting more water requires a trek back down to the creek. My dad's name was Mike. As a kid, as most kids do, I thought my dad was a superhero. I have never, not once, seen him get scared of anything. He had spent his whole life outdoors hunting and fishing and hiking. He was even a volunteer firefighter back in our town. He always carried his .357 revolver when we went out camping. Not because he was paranoid, but because, as he put it, you never know what you're going to run into out there. His two friends, Dave and Rick, were the same way. Very tough, outdoorsy guys who knew how to handle themselves in the woods. I felt very safe with all of them there. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't scared at all. The first day, we did spend a lot of time around Barney Lake itself. The place was incredible. I can still smell the air carrying the scent of pine. The lake was cold but perfect for swimming. I spent the evening just sitting around eating snacks and listening to my dad and his friends swap old hunting stories. As the sun was beginning to set, we made the hike back to where we had picked a spot to camp. We had set everything up earlier that day, so we all just crawled into our tents for the night. I shared a tent with my dad while Dave and Rick had their own. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. At first, I didn't understand why I'd actually woke up. Maybe a bad dream or just the discomfort of sleeping on the ground. But as I closed my eyes to try and go back to sleep, I began to hear something moving outside. It was very quick and very shocking. Something huge just thundered through our camp, shaking the ground as it ran. I could hear these deep, ragged breaths, almost like it was growling with an exhale, as it ran through. My heart was pounding. I'll never forget how scared I was at that moment. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was just a bear or something had spooked a deer. But then I heard it come back, and it circled halfway around the camp back to the original spot where I heard it from the first time. I heard a bunch of trees and branches being snapped. I began to hear footsteps just beyond our tent. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing through. It was watching us, or you could say stalking us. I nudged my dad to wake him up. He finally stirred, groggy until he heard the noises too. His whole body went stiff. He put his finger to his lips, signaling me to stay quiet. Then slowly he reached for his revolver. The sound of the hammer clicking back sent an eerie silence over the campsite. Whatever that thing was outside, it had heard it, and the footsteps stopped. For a few seconds there was nothing. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Then my dad moved. He carefully unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. I saw him grab his flashlight with his left hand, keeping the revolver steady in his right. He clicked the light on. That's when I saw his entire body go rigid. I barely had the courage to peek out myself, but I did, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Standing just beyond the trees was something I know wasn't human. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall. From head to toe, covered in hair, I couldn't tell what color, it was just too dark. I would guess a really dark brown, maybe even black, I'm not sure. I do know that it had a chest like a barrel, and its eyes glowed a deep, menacing red color. It had a snout like a wolf, but its face was twisted into something that looked almost angry. It almost looked demonic in nature. It wasn't just a regular animal from this area. My dad slowly raised his revolver. The very instant that he aimed, the creature took off like a bullet. It moved so fast that he couldn't keep up with it with the flashlight. It crashed through the woods like a tornado, disappearing into the forest like a ghost. Dad did not hesitate. He climbed out and woke up Dave and Rick immediately. Within seconds, all of us were outside, huddled around with flashlights and guns in hand. I don't remember anyone saying very much. They just put me in the middle and formed a circle with their backs to each other, watching in all directions. We all knew far well that we were not alone, and that thing was not gone. You could feel its presence. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I promise you could feel it. It never came back around the camp again that night. At first sign of light, we broke up camp pretty fast. My dad had hung the food bag high in the tree away from our tents to keep animals from getting to it. But when we went to retrieve it, the entire branch, a thick, sturdy branch, had been snapped clean off. The bag and the rope were both gone. We didn't stick around to investigate or look for the food bag. We packed everything up and left. The whole hike back to the truck felt like we were being followed. None of them spoke a word until we were inside the vehicle, speeding down the dirt road back towards civilization. Dad never talked about it again, not once after that. I overheard him whispering the day it happened. Even Rick, before we left the campsite, he was describing exactly what he had seen. But after that day, he shut it out completely. If I ever tried bringing it up, he would just shake his head and say, "Forget it, son." But I never did, and I never will. I am obsessed with the Dogman phenomenon. Years later, after the encounter, now that I'm older, I started researching. I read stories of creatures that people called dogmen, upright wolf-like creatures being spotted in remote places across the country. I started realizing that whatever we saw that night wasn't a bear, it wasn't a mountain lion, it wasn't anything normal. It was a dogman. I know it because I saw it. I don't know exactly what that thing wanted or why it was so angry. Maybe it just wanted us to leave. That's what I think, anyway. Or maybe it was just curious. I don't know. Maybe it was deciding whether or not we were prey. God, I really hope that's not what happened. That makes it even scarier. All I do know is after that night, I've never looked at the woods the same way again. And neither did my dad, up until the point that he passed away. Now he took his encounter to his grave. That's why I'm here today typing this out. He can't tell the story, but I damn well can, and I just did. And I want to thank you for allowing me a place to do that. I truly appreciate what you're doing. Please don't hesitate to stay in touch. Michael. I don't think I'll ever go hiking again. It started as a simple weekend trip, just me, my brother Darren, and our friends Kyle and Mike. We wanted to explore a stretch of forest in Tennessee's Smoky Mountains, far from the usual tourist spots and trails. We had a route planned, nothing crazy, just a 3-day trip through some rugged backcountry. The first day was uneventful. We made camp near a shallow creek, drank a few beers, and laughed around the fire. By midday on the second day, we stumbled upon something unexpected. A cave. It wasn't marked on our maps. The entrance was small, just a dark slit between moss-covered rocks, barely noticeable unless you were right on top of it. Kyle, always the adventurous one, was the first to suggest we check it out. I joked around telling them this is exactly how horror movies start. Something about that cave unsettled me. Still, peer pressure is a hell of a thing, so we squeezed inside. The cave was deeper than we expected. Our flashlights barely done anything through the thick darkness, revealing damp rock walls and a tunnel leading downward. The air was thick, stale, carrying a smell that made my stomach twist. Smelled like wet fur and sulfur. I remember hearing Mike say very low, "Something has been living in here." That's when we should have turned back, but we kept going, curiosity getting the better of us. The passage narrowed, forcing us to crouch. Then, about 50 feet in, Kyle's flashlight beam landed on something that made my skin crawl. Bones. Not just one or two, piles of them. Some were small, likely from tiny animals, but others were big. A deep, guttural growl echoed from somewhere deeper in the cave. The sound wasn't familiar to me. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. It was something else. Something that sounded highly angry. Kyle's flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something move at the edge of his light. A shape, tall and hunched forward, pressed against the cave wall. Then when the light went out completely, we were not alone. The next few seconds were chaos. Darren turned immediately and ran, scrambling back the way we came. Kyle cursed, fumbling with his flashlight. I grabbed Mike's arm and pulled him toward the entrance. Then I heard it, the sound of something large, something fast, moving in the darkness behind us. Claws scraping against rock. Heavy, deliberate breathing. And then a snarl so deep and inhuman it vibrated in my chest. We ran like hell. Kyle was the last one out, and I swear something grabbed him as he scrambled through the opening. He let out a choked scream, his leg jerking back into the cave as if something had latched onto him. Darren and I grabbed his arms, yanking him free. We didn't stop running until we were back at camp. The nightmare was definitely not over yet. Kyle's leg was gashed pretty bad. It looked like a claw mark running from his calf to almost to his ankle. He was in shock, muttering, "It had hands, it had hands," over and over. We built the biggest fire we could, and none of us slept. Somewhere out in the woods it was moving. We could hear it circling us, staying out of sight. The snap of twigs, the occasional deep breath. It was playing with us. Then, just before dawn, it stepped into view. It stood at the edge of the trees, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, its body covered in matted, thick fur. Its arms were muscular and long, and they ended in large raccoon-looking hands with claws on the tips of the fingers. Its head was a grotesque mixture of man and wolf. Elongated snout, piercing yellow eyes, and ears that I literally saw twitching as it was staring at us. It's like it was just waiting while it was watching us, waiting for us to move. That's when it did something that sent chills down my spine, and it still does, and it will from now until the end. This thing smiled. A deliberate grin that pulled back its black lips, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. Darren grabbed the flare gun and fired. The red light streaked into the sky, and for a brief second the creature flinched. Then it was gone. It vanished into the trees without a sound. We packed up and got the hell out of there as soon as the sun was completely up. Kyle needed stitches. He told the doctors he got attacked by a wild animal. We never told them the exact truth. I mean, who would believe that? A few days later, I looked up disappearances in that area. It turns out hikers have gone missing near those caves for quite a few years now. Now I can't stop thinking about that smile. It wasn't just an animal, it was something that's not supposed to be real. something that knew what it was doing. And I know for a fact that that thing let us go. This time, anyway. Thank you, Anonymous.